All levels of government in countries around the world are facing unprecedented economic challenges in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, but cities are on the front lines of this crisis, and unlike other levels of government, they can't run a budgetary deficit. Here's Ontario Premier Doug Ford on that question earlier today.
I know they're struggling. All levels of government right now are struggling financially based on this COVID-19. And we're going to do whatever it takes. I've said from day one, I won't spare a penny to make sure that we support the people of Ontario.
Today, Toronto Mayor John Tory said that his city is bleeding about $65 million a week, and overall, the pandemic could cost Toronto $1.5 billion. So just how cash-strapped are Canada's cities as a result of this pandemic? Naheed Nenshi is the mayor of Calgary, Brian Bowman is the mayor of Winnipeg, and John Tory is the mayor of Toronto. They all join me from their respective cities. Hi, mayors. Great to see you. Thanks for making time for us this evening.
Hi. Thanks. Good afternoon.
I'm going to start off with sort of a uniform question because for our viewers who are maybe not familiar with each of your city's circumstances, if you could summarize for us the state of your finances at this moment because of the pandemic, and if you did so in sort of a couple short sentences, what would you say? Mayor Bowman, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, we've just balanced 4 years going forward. And so we've actually done that, replenished our fiscal stabilization fund. So I don't think we're in as bad shape as some other cities, but we're bleeding about $12 million a month right now in lost revenues, about $6 million in lost transit revenues because we've got obviously a lot less people using transit, and about another $6 million elsewhere. And so the longer this goes, the more that it's going to put pressure on our overall operating and other budgets.
Mayor Nenshi, what are the revenue pressures on your city like right now?
So us too, relatively very well run, good cash position, but we can't run that deficit. And so by the end of the year, I estimate we'll be down about $400 million. As it stands, we're down about $15 million a week. So just as Brian was saying, bleeding money through lost revenue and increased expenses in dealing with the crisis at the front lines, as we always do.
Mayor Tory, your situation?
Well, the finances were very stable before the pandemic, but now we're bleeding $65 million a week between increased expenses on looking after homeless people and so on, but also mostly decreased revenues, $20 million a week, for example, because we went from carrying 1.5 million people a day on the public transit system to now 600,000. And so we do, if you just do the math, we now calculate that by the end of the year, that's assuming a 3-month lockdown, and then a 6-month recovery period through the end of the year, that will end up causing us to be short about $1.5 billion.
So let me follow up with you, Mayor Tory, because the question that the Premier Ford was answering was one about changing the laws to allow cities to run deficits. I spoke to the mayor of Vancouver last week who said that's not a great idea. It's not like it's easy for us to raise the money to pay off that deficit in the future. What is your take on being able to run a deficit? Is that something that you would hope Premier Ford would act on?
I think if it's done as a kind of a breathing space measure, perhaps, but I would say it is not the right way to go. What we need, quite frankly, and these are cities right across the country, not just Toronto, we need the support of the other governments, because what they have that we don't have is they have things called HST. They have income tax, they have corporate tax, and the best investment they could make is in the economic engines of this country, Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, and so on, because that's where the recovery will happen, and then that will replenish their coffers with the very same HST, income tax, corporate tax, and so on. We don't have those levers to raise that money, and allowing us to run a deficit still leaves the question open, well, where do you get the money from to pay off the deficit that you incurred if you were allowed to do so?
Mayor Nenshi, I see you nodding there. Have there been conversations with the province in Alberta about this, the provincial government in Alberta about this, and what about with the federal government?
Yeah, you're not going to get a piece of paper between me, John, and Brian. We're all in exactly the same position. And John said it better than I could. It could work as a very short-term temporary thing, but let's remember deficits are just future taxation with interest. The real issue here is that we don't have the liquidity as cities to be able to have access to the same short-term borrowing as the other orders of government. And it was really nice to hear Premier Ford said he won't spare a penny. Premier Kenney also said we will spare no expense in this. Those are great things to hear. But fundamentally, the provinces are also broke. in Alberta in particular is very broke. And today the Fed, and I don't usually, speak for Premier Kenney, but he's got a point in that the federal government today can borrow money for less than 1%. We've never before asked the federal government for assistance in our operating budgets as cities. It's time that we're asking, because these are extraordinary circumstances, and ultimately it will have to be the federal government supplying the backstop here. And I think Brian has a very different perspective that comes to the same conclusion.
Mayor Bowman, your perspective on that question?
Yeah, I mean, great points all around. What's different from other levels of government is municipal governments are not allowed to borrow for operating, and we are also provincially mandated to balance our budgets each year. I support that. In our case in Calgary and Toronto, very well run governments, but this is putting a squeeze on us unlike any other situation we faced before. And what is also different is we just don't have the levers. John pointed out, PST, GST, income tax. When other levels of government cash in good economic times, there's a corresponding obligation and ability to help in times like this that we simply don't have, because any additional dollars we're spending, even if we had the balanced budget legislation lifted even temporarily, we're going to put that on property taxes. And right now, most of us have provided property and business tax deferral plans. The last thing that would help property owners and businesses coming out of this in terms of economic recovery would be to double down and impose even more tax burden on them. Right. It should be done in a smart way, and it's really demonstrating how archaic the taxation models are across Canada for municipalities.
Mayor Tory, what have the conversations been like with the federal government? Is there receptiveness to the plea that mayors like yourself are making?
I would say yes. And by the way, I should say I think the federal government has really stepped up in terms of the programs they've offered for people who are in trouble financially, individual people, for businesses. But they've acknowledged, certainly in conversations with me, and we had a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister today, the big city mayors did, all of us were on that call. And they've acknowledged that they understand municipalities have these problems. They understand that we are limited in terms of how we can raise money. And I think this government has understood all the way along how important cities are to the economic strength of the country. So if you want to have a good recovery that is beneficial to all Canadians, then start with the cities, because we can, generate a lot of economic activity, a lot of jobs, and repay them that revenue, more than once over. But we've got to have the solid recovery, and that's going to mean that our finances have to be stable as well. So I would say that they are receptive, but nobody's written any checks just yet.
How fast does that check need to be written from your perspective, Mayor Nenshi?
Well, in Calgary, and I think Winnipeg and Toronto are all the same in that we're not at risk of going bankrupt today. We have a little bit of time to get this right, but we all have the end of our year. Our fiscal year ends December 31st, and we got to be to the good and have this problem solved by then. Frankly, we should solve it long before then.
I guess as a follow-up,
I should also mention that you're talking to 3 large cities that are very well run financially. But this is every municipality. And some of those smaller municipalities actually are going to have trouble making payroll next month. And so it's important that we get a solution in place quickly.
I guess on the subject of payroll, we've seen a number of cities had to make layoffs as a result of the decrease in revenues. And Mayor Bowman, I'm wondering if I take everyone's point, of course, on the sort of stabilization, the stability of your 3 cities, but if those checks aren't coming in the near future, does that mean more layoffs?
It absolutely could, and all those options are on the table for all of us. Just this week, we laid off about 674 employees. These are seasonal workers, but we're looking at certainly transit reductions right now. And the longer this goes on, the tighter the squeeze it will be for all of us. And so even if we don't have cash in hand from the federal government, just to have a commitment and an indication could certainly help with the decisions that we'll need to make in order to meet our balanced budget legislation. And like other provinces, I mean, we're getting no indication from our provincial government that there'll be any financial support. And in fact, they're trying to recommend that we cut deeper right now. The
provinces?
Yes. Yeah. All mayors in Manitoba received a letter yesterday from our Minister of Municipal Relations. The implication was urging us to dig deeper. And so We're not expecting we're going to be getting financial support from the provincial government. And keep in mind, we're creatures of provincial statute. But the fact that the federal government is open and has been as accessible as they have been is something that is incredibly important, because keep in mind, these are the services that ensure the safety of our residents: clean and safe drinking water, garbage being picked up, first responders when you call 911. I mean, these are not nice to haves. Municipalities provide incredibly vital services to Canadians, and the majority of Canadians live in Canada's big cities.
Just before I let you go, Mayor Bowman, I just want to be clear. Has the Premier indicated to you that there's no money? Is there a fiscal situation there that they're presented with? Or when you say they implied that you dig deep, what was the actual wording, I guess?
The urging is they're in tight financial circumstances, and we all need to do our part. And so the way in which the correspondence that was sent out to the municipalities was interpreted as a request to dig deep. Of course, we've balanced our budgets, and so we're in relatively better financial shape. But our flexibility and ability to deal with this is limited based on the financial structures that are in place for municipalities.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, all three of you, very much for making time on this Friday evening. I really appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thanks to
Stay safe,
Calgary
everyone.
Mayor Naheed Nenshi, Winnipeg Mayor Brian Bowman, and Toronto Mayor John Tory. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.